My name is Vivian. I'm 66 years old, and a few months ago, I created a fake profile on social media just to find out if my husband still loved me. We've been married for over 40 years. We've been through a lot together, including the cancer that almost took my life, and along with it, the woman I used to be. After the illness, my body changed, my self-esteem disappeared, and the silence inside our home kept growing. Frank, my husband, was never much of a talker, but over time, even the small gestures faded. One day, I realized what hurt wasn't that he didn't touch me. It was that he no longer saw me. And that's when I did something I never imagined I'd do. I created a fake profile, a made-up name, a photo of some random woman, and started chatting with the man who had been sleeping beside me for 4 decades. What I discovered in the weeks that followed was, this is the story of a woman who had to become someone else just to be noticed, and how in the end, all she really wanted was to be loved exactly as she was. If this story is already stirring something inside you, stay with me until the end, because maybe, deep down, it's a little bit your story too. Tell me in the comments. Have you ever been afraid of not being seen by someone who once said they loved you? And if you enjoy stories like this, full of truth, emotion, and second chances, make sure to subscribe. Here, every story feels like a hug, and you're always welcome. My name is Vivian. I'm 66 years old, and a few months ago, I created a fake profile on social media to find out if my husband still loved me. We've been married for over 40 years. We've been through so much together, including the cancer that nearly took my life, and with it, the woman I used to be. After the illness, my body changed, my self-esteem disappeared, and the silence inside our home kept growing. Frank, my husband, was never one to talk much, but over time, even the little gestures vanished. One day, I realized what hurt the most wasn't that he didn't touch me, it was that he no longer saw me. And that's when I did something unthinkable. I created a profile with a fake name, a photo of some random woman, and started talking to the man who had been sleeping beside me for 4 decades. What I discovered over the next few weeks was, this is the story of a woman who had to become someone else just to be noticed, and how in the end, all she really wanted was to be loved exactly as she was. It didn't happen all at once. The idea grew slowly, like a weed planted by silence. Every time I tried to start a conversation, and he answered with a every time he looked at me like I was a chair, a plant, or a wall, a part of me died a little. Then, on some ordinary evening, alone in our bedroom, my face lit by the cold blue glow of my phone, I found myself creating a new email. A fake name, a made-up birthday, a woman 5 years younger than me, with a smile I didn't know how to make anymore. Choosing the photo was the hardest part. I didn't want to use anyone I knew, but I also didn't want to look like a model out of a catalog. I ended up choosing an image from a random stock site, a woman sitting by the sea, wearing a hat, turned away from the camera. Her face wasn't visible, but her body reminded me of mine before the surgery. I called her Claire, a soft, simple name, easy to type and impossible to confuse with who I really was. When I finished setting up the profile, I stared at the screen and hesitated. All I had to do was click follow, just that. But my hand trembled like I was about to commit a crime. It took me almost an hour to decide. And when I finally clicked, my heart raced. I felt heat rising up my neck, as if I'd done something unforgivable. But I also felt a strange relief, almost childish, like tossing a message in a bottle out into the sea. Frank accepted the request the next day. No questions. didn't even look that closely. And 2 hours later, he messaged me. "Hi, do we know each other?" I read that sentence about 10 times. It wasn't exactly romantic, but it was more than I'd heard from him in months. I sat down on the edge of the bed, phone in hand, and took a deep breath. "Maybe not," I replied. "But sometimes strangers recognize each other before they even meet." That's how it started. Slow, hesitant, full of unspoken things. At first he seemed unsure, but little by little he opened up. We talked about books, old music, a cafe he liked, one I knew all too well. Each word typed made me more confused. It was frank, but it was someone else. Softer, gentler, as if the best parts of him had hidden away from me and were now showing up for another woman. Only that woman was me. In the days that followed, I became two women. During the day, I was Vivian, the wife he barely noticed, who made dinner in silence, who asked how work was and got a tired fine in return. At night, I was Claire, the woman who made him laugh with silly gifts, who received unexpected compliments, who got messages full of ellipses and exclamation marks. It felt strange, and in some ways, cruel. But inside that dangerous little game, I felt alive. Frank started telling me stories I'd never heard before. He talked about an old movie he loved, one his wife never wanted to watch. He said sometimes he felt invisible at home, like everything was in its place, but he didn't matter anymore. I read those words and wanted to scream. Invisible? He was the one who stopped looking at me, who walked past me like I was furniture. But at the same time, had I also stopped seeing him? I started paying more attention. I watched the way he sat on the couch, staring into nothing. How long he lingered in the car before turning off the radio. How he took his time in the shower, maybe because it was the only place left where he could think. For the first time in a long time, I was really seeing my husband, not as the man who ignores me, but as someone who might be just as lost as I was. And that hurt. It hurt to realize we had drifted apart so slowly, and neither of us had asked for help. One night he wrote, "Claire, talking to you reminds me who I used to be. Thank you for that." I stared at that message like it weighed 100 pounds. I knew that man. I loved that man. But he was falling in love with someone I had made up. And the cruelest part of all was knowing that woman was all that remained of me when no one else could see me anymore. I thought about stopping, deleting the profile, disappearing, pretending it had all been a mistake. But I couldn't, because deep down, Claire was also me. She was the part of me that still knew how to listen, to laugh, to flirt, to care. She was the Vivian that cancer didn't destroy, that silence didn't bury. And now that she was alive again, I didn't want to lose her so soon. The next morning I placed a cup of coffee in front of him, gently. I waited for a comment, a smile, anything. But he just said thanks, without lifting his eyes from the paper. And that's when I realized he was falling, yes, but not for the woman in front of him. He was falling for the one who texted him at night, with the same broken heart. The next morning, I tried to act like everything was normal. I made coffee, set the table, folded his towel like I always did. Frank walked past me, grabbed his mug, muttered a thanks, and walked off without looking at me. I sat down at the kitchen table and stared into the steam rising from my cup like it might give me an answer. It felt like he was living in two different worlds. In one of them, we were strangers sharing a roof. In the other, he was falling in love with me, but didn't know it. I spent the rest of the day on autopilot. I went to the store, called my daughter, read half a book I couldn't focus on. Everything felt gray, suspended, out of place. And the whole time, part of me was just waiting for the next message. It came late in the afternoon. "Claire, would you like to have coffee with me?" My heart started racing. Not from fear, from pain. I had caused this, wanted this, fed this. But now that the moment was here, all I could think about was the emptiness that sat between us at the breakfast table every morning, and the fact that he had the courage to invite a stranger while staying silent with me. I took my time responding. I could have said no, ended it right there. But something in me needed to look him in the eye, no filters, no screens, no masks, and see if he'd still recognize me. I wrote back, yes, when and where. He suggested a quiet little cafe near the park, said he liked the place because it was peaceful and discreet. That's when I realized he was scared. Maybe deep down, he knew this wasn't just some flirtation. It was an escape. I didn't sleep that night. I pulled out old photo albums, tried on clothes I hadn't worn in years, cried in front of the mirror. Deep down, I wanted him to see me, to look at me and say, "It's you." But what terrified me most was the possibility that he wouldn't, that he'd see me with new eyes and still not recognize me. The morning of the meeting, I got dressed slowly. I chose a blue blouse, the same one I wore on our 30th wedding anniversary. This wasn't a trap. It was a hope. I left the house before he did, walked to the cafe, and sat at the table by the window. My heart was pounding, my hands trembled, and for the first time in a long while, I felt alive. Scared, yes, but alive. 5 minutes later, he walked in. Same brown jacket he wore on Sundays, same distant eyes, same steady walk. He looked around, searching for Claire. Then he saw me. His eyes landed on mine for a few seconds, and froze. The cup in front of me trembled slightly. I didn't say a word. I just waited, because in that moment, everything I needed to know was in the silence between us. He stood there at the entrance for a long moment. He looked around, as if still hoping to see someone else. But then his eyes returned to me. There was no anger, no shock. There was something worse. Uncertainty. Like he was staring at something he couldn't make sense of. I stood up slowly, like someone approaching a cliff. He walked toward me without a word. When he sat down across from me, we both knew nothing would ever be the same. "It was you all along?" he asked, voice low, almost a whisper. I nodded. There was nothing left to hide. No more pretending. "Why?" he asked again. I took a deep breath. "Because I needed to know if you were still capable of loving me." He looked away, as if those words hurt more than they should have. And for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that maybe had always been there. Fear. Fear of me. Fear of himself. Fear of the truth we had built together and then buried under years of silence. "You deceived me, Vivian." His voice wasn't angry. It was sad. But I was sad too. And tired. "I just wanted to know if you still saw me. If you'd still choose me." He ran his hand down his face, like he was trying to push away reality. But reality was sitting right there in front of him, holding a coffee cup, with her heart laid bare. We talked for over an hour, or better said, we poured out everything that had been stuck between us for years. I spoke about the cancer, the pain of feeling disfigured, the loneliness of sleeping beside someone who never touched me. He spoke about his fear of messing things up, the shame of not knowing how to win me back, the cowardice of hiding in silence. There were no raised voices, just quiet tears, long looks, and pauses that said more than words ever could. And for the first time in a long while, we were honest. At the end of it, he looked at me and said, "Claire made me feel good, but it was you I wanted to say all that to." My chest tightened. Then why didn't you? He looked down. Because I thought you didn't want to hear it anymore. We sat in silence. The bill came, and with it, a bitter taste of something ending and something beginning. We left the cafe side by side. We didn't touch. We didn't make any promises. But something between us had shifted. We didn't know if we were going back to the same home or building a new one from the pieces that were left. But one thing was certain. Now that we'd truly seen each other again, we could no longer pretend nothing had happened or that nothing needed to change. That night, the house felt different, not because of the furniture or the silence, but because of the tension in the air. Frank stayed in the office for hours, like he did when he needed to think. I went to the bedroom, took off the blue blouse, folded it carefully, and put it away like it meant something. It wasn't about him seeing me anymore. It was about me seeing myself. And for the first time in years, I knew who I was. I looked at myself in the mirror, not as Vivian the wife, not as Claire the illusion, but as a woman, with wrinkles, scars, longing, and desire. A woman who had survived illness, loneliness, indifference. A woman who had the courage to break the silence, not for revenge, but for the need to exist. The next day, Frank called me outside. We sat on the porch, he with his coffee and I with mine. We didn't speak for a few minutes. Then he began. I've been thinking a lot since yesterday. About everything. About us. My heart sped up, but I stayed calm. He looked smaller, not physically, but in his posture, like someone carrying guilt and not knowing where to put it. I don't know how to start over, Vivian, but I want to try. I wasn't expecting that. Maybe I thought he'd offer excuses, explanations, or just more silence, but not that quiet, hesitant request to reconnect. I looked at him cautiously. I don't want to go back to who we were before. He nodded. Neither do I. I want us to be new, in our own way. In the days that followed, we started slowly. Short conversations, quiet walks, meals outside the routine. No promises, no pressure. At night, he'd sometimes sit next to me on the couch and rest his head on my shoulder. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. It was awkward, sometimes uncomfortable. But there was something beautiful about learning to be together again. I deleted Claire's profile on a rainy morning. No drama, no goodbye. I just opened the app and erased everything. She had served her purpose. She brought me back to myself. But now it was my turn to live as who I truly was. No masks, no games, no fear. And if he was going to see me, then let it be all of me. Starting over wasn't romantic. There was no music playing, no dramatic reunion. It was strange, slow, and sometimes uncomfortable. We'd spent so much time pretending everything was fine that facing the truth now required a different kind of courage. In those first days, Frank tried to reach me in small ways, offering to help in the kitchen, starting conversations about things I didn't even know he remembered. And I wanted to welcome that. But my body still ached from the absence, not the physical kind, but the kind that stays even when the person is right there in front of you, present, trying. It was hard to trust again, because even though he was looking at me now, there was still a wounded version of Vivian inside me asking every day, why did he only see me when I became someone else? That question echoed in the silences between our words, in the moments when he forgot I had once been Claire and treated me only as Vivian again. I knew he was trying, but my wound wasn't in a hurry, and I had learned through time and pain that healing doesn't mean erasing. It means accepting what left a mark, and not every scar has to be hidden. One afternoon we went for a walk in the park. Same path as always, but it felt different. Frank spoke little, as usual, but walked beside me at my pace. When we passed an empty bench, he stopped, looked at me and said, "This is where we sat when you told me you were pregnant with our daughter." I said nothing. He went on, "You were shaking so much, and all I could think was how strong you were." Those words cracked something open inside me. It was as if, finally, he was trying to return to the man I once loved. Not the one behind a screen, but the one from real life. That night, I came home feeling lighter. I opened an old box in the closet and pulled out some pictures of us, from a time when things were simpler. I sat on the bed, spread them out across the blanket, and looked at our younger selves, smiling, carefree, in love. I didn't cry, but I felt a deep ache, the kind of nostalgia that doesn't want to go back, but wants to remember what hope looked like. I put the photos away, not to relive the past, but to say, this is also who I am. And for some reason I can't explain, I slept better that night. Frank started asking me questions he hadn't asked in years. How I was feeling, what I wanted to do, what kind of movies I liked. It was strange to see this man, the one who had hidden behind routine for so long, trying to rediscover me. Sometimes I answered sweetly, sometimes with caution, because it was still hard to believe that his interest was real, that he wasn't just trying to fix something out of guilt. But slowly, through one conversation after another, I started opening little spaces inside myself. Not to forget, but to rebuild. I began doing things just for me, things I used to put off, out of fear or habit. I started painting my nails again, choosing clothes with more care, going out for coffee alone, just to feel like the world still belonged to me. Frank noticed. One day, as I was heading out, he looked at me and said, "You look beautiful." It was the first time in many years I'd heard that from him, and even though part of me wanted to ignore it, another part, more alive, more mine, quietly smiled inside. Because I wasn't waiting to be seen anymore. I was already seeing myself. One night, I sat out on the porch with a glass of wine left over from Sunday lunch. The breeze was cool, and the street was quiet. Frank was in the bedroom reading, and I was out there, alone, at peace. I picked up my phone and on impulse opened the old message history with Claire, or rather, the fake profile I had deleted days ago. There was nothing left, no messages, no pictures. But I realized something important. I didn't miss Claire. I missed the version of myself I had been when I allowed myself to be heard. That's when I understood that the biggest betrayal in this story wasn't between me and Frank. It was between me and myself. I had abandoned myself for years. I waited to be noticed, valued, desired, without realizing that the first gaze I needed was my own. And once I understood that, everything changed. Not because the pain went away, but because I stopped relying on someone else to prove I deserved love. And that, for me, was the beginning of everything. Frank came out to the porch a little later. He sat beside me in silence. We stared out into the darkness like people staring inward. He handed me a piece of chocolate he'd brought from the kitchen, and I accepted it. We chuckled softly. It was simple. It was beautiful. After a while, he looked at me and said, "You're still here." And I replied, without hesitation, "I am. But now, for me." He nodded and stayed there with me, saying nothing more. And in that moment, it was all I needed in the days that followed. Life carried on, with its ups and downs, as always. We had small arguments about the house, the kids, what to cook. But something between us had changed. There was a kind of care now that didn't come from duty. It came from choice. He still wasn't the most talkative man in the world. But now, when he looked at me, it felt like he actually saw, and I didn't have to shout to be heard anymore. I started writing about all of it. I found an old, hard-covered notebook and began filling its pages with scattered thoughts, fragments of memory, feelings that didn't have a place in daily life. It was my way of making sure the pain didn't just turn to dust. I wanted it to become something useful, something beautiful. And deep down, I wanted to remind myself that pain was what pushed me back into living, the pain and the courage to start over. One morning, Frank made coffee on his own. He placed flowers on the table, daisies, my favorite. I came downstairs, and when I saw it, a lump rose in my throat, not because of the surprise, but because of the tenderness. He looked at me, smiled, and said, "Today, I wanted to be the first to say good morning." And in that simple sentence, there was a whole love. A love that didn't come with promises, but with presence. The daisies stayed on the table for 3 days. I couldn't bring myself to replace them. They felt like a part of me that had bloomed again, quiet, simple, but alive. On the third morning, when I saw some of the petals starting to wilt, I stood in front of the vase, uncertain. I could have thrown them out, like I did with so many old flowers, but I decided to replace them with new ones. Not to repeat Frank's gesture, but to remind myself that the one taking care of me now was me. I began looking at the details of the house with new eyes. I changed the pillows in the living room, reconnected the old kitchen radio, went back to listening to the music that once kept me company when no one else did. It wasn't about creating a brand new home. It was about reconnecting with what used to bring me joy before everything fell apart. Frank noticed, but didn't interfere. I believe he understood that this process belonged to me, and it was beautiful to see how he respected that, as if he knew that we couldn't rebuild us until I had rebuilt me. One night, we had a long conversation, no wine, no ceremony. Just the two of us, sitting at the edge of the bed like people in a hurry to be honest. He spoke about the fear of losing me. I spoke about the fear of losing myself in a marriage where I no longer recognized who I was. We said truths that hurt but helped. And in the end, he gently held my hand and said, "I want to keep learning how to love you, the right way this time." I didn't make any promises, but I didn't pull my hand away either, because sometimes what saves us isn't a promise. It's the willingness to try. And Frank was trying, with gestures, with silences that no longer felt cold, with eyes that no longer avoided mine. I didn't know if I could love him the way I once did, but I was starting to love this new version of him, and above all, I was learning to love myself like never before. That week, I got a call from my daughter. She noticed something different in my voice, asked if everything was okay. I said yes, and for the first time in a long time, it was true. She told me she was coming to visit over the weekend with the grandkids. I smiled, found myself planning lunch, tidying the guest room, organizing the bookshelf. Not to show off perfection, but to show presence, because now I was whole, present, back. On Saturday, when she arrived, she hugged me longer than usual. Maybe she had felt my absence too, even if she never put it into words. Frank came into the room a moment later, greeted the grandkids warmly, brought juice for everyone, smiled more than I remembered him smiling in years. My daughter glanced at me and whispered, "What happened here?" And I simply answered, "We started over." She smiled, and I felt like the world was slowly falling back into place. On Sunday night, after everyone had left, I sat down again with my notebook. I wrote about the weekend, about the daisies, the grandkids, The chicken and rice I burned because I was too distracted by the laughter at the table. I wrote about Frank, too, and about myself, about who I had been, who I was becoming, and who I still had the chance to be. The words flowed more easily now, as if everything that had been trapped inside for years had finally found a way out. I decided to give the notebook a name. Things I've Learned by Being Me. It wasn't a diary. It was a record of rediscoveries, of feelings I had never given room to, and of things I wished the Vivian from 20 years ago had known. Maybe one day I'll read it aloud to my granddaughter, or maybe I'll keep it just for myself, like a beautiful secret. Frank started noticing my writing. One night, he asked, "Can I read it?" I hesitated, not because there was anything incriminating in it, but because it was all so raw, so real, so mine. I took a deep breath and said, "Not yet, but maybe someday." He nodded with quiet respect, and that made me love him a little more. There was one night when it rained hard. The power went out for a few minutes, and we sat in the living room, lit only by the emergency candle we always kept in the drawer. I was lying on the couch. He sat beside me, his arm resting gently across my legs. The sound of the rain tapping against the window was the only noise, and in that warm darkness, he whispered, "Are you afraid this could all end?" I answered without thinking, "Not anymore, because now I know how to live with myself." Maybe that was the most intimate moment we'd shared in years, not because of touch, but because of vulnerability, because being together means this, knowing it could end and still choosing to stay. Frank understood that, and so did I. We weren't the same people anymore, but there was a version of us there that deserved a chance. I ended that night by writing one more page in my notebook. I wrote, "When we stop begging to be loved, we start learning how to truly love." I closed the notebook gently, blew out the candle, and went to sleep with a heart at peace. Our daily life started to feel a little lighter. There were still cloudy days between us, like in any shared life. But now, the silences weren't aggressive anymore. They were pauses, spaces where respect could breathe. Frank and I began discovering new ways of being together. Small things, like commenting on a movie scene, sharing the cooking, listening to music without saying a word. It wasn't the love of our youth. It was something else. Slower, gentler, more real. One day, I got a memory notification on my phone, an old photo of us smiling during a trip to the coast. I stared at that picture like someone gazing into a distant past that still lived in some quiet corner of the soul. Frank came up behind me, saw the photo, and said, "I think that day we still knew how to laugh without fear." I stayed quiet for a few seconds. Then I said, "And I think now we're learning to laugh again." He smiled, a small smile, but real. And in that moment, I realized our past selves weren't lost. They were just asleep, waiting for the courage to return. I started going out more on my own, not to escape, but to reconnect. I'd go to the movies in the middle of the afternoon, wander through bookstores, sit in cafes with my notebook and a glass of wine. Sometimes Frank would ask if he could come along. Other times he'd simply say, "Enjoy it." And that was freedom. Not the freedom of being alone, but the freedom of knowing I could be whole, with or without company. One day, I ran into an old friend from college. She looked at me with surprise and said, "You look different." I smiled and replied, "That's because now I listen to myself." We talked for hours. She had her own stories, long silences, unfinished loves. We laughed, got emotional, promised not to lose touch again. I came home that night with a heart full of gratitude because there's still time. Time to begin again, to restore old bonds, to feel new at 66. That night, I wrote one more sentence in my notebook. It's never too late to bloom, even if it's already autumn. That's exactly how I felt, that my time hadn't ended, that I wasn't growing older to disappear. I was growing older to bloom more truthfully. Frank saw me writing and didn't say a word. He just brought me a cup of tea and said, "I think this moment deserves to be written down too." And he was right, because now, even the smallest moments had meaning. One night, while we were cleaning up the kitchen together, Frank asked me, "If you could talk to the woman who created that fake profile, what would you say to her today?" I froze, holding the dish towel in my hands, looking out at the dark window. After a while, I answered softly, "I'd tell her she was afraid, but thanks to that fear, she found courage." He nodded, looked at me gently, and added, "And thanks to her, I found you again." That conversation stayed with me for days, not because he understood everything, but because we had reached a level of listening that didn't exist before. It felt like we weren't trying to win each other anymore. We were learning to walk side by side. This new way of being together was softer, more careful. We didn't impose ourselves. We didn't demand. We listened. We looked. And little by little, we began to recognize each other again. Frank started writing too. A new habit. Unexpected. He showed me an old notebook where he had started jotting down thoughts, memories, bits of lyrics that had marked moments in our life together. I read a few pages, and I cried. There was a man in those lines I didn't know, but who had been beside me all along, maybe just waiting to be invited into the light. And now, he was coming forward, slowly, but completely. We started small rituals. On Tuesdays, we'd eat out. On Saturdays, coffee on the porch. We even started a shared notebook where we'd write letters to each other, letters only to be read on Sunday nights. It was our way of saying things we still didn't know how to say out loud. And it worked, because in that written space, our souls met with less fear and more truth. One of those letters said, "Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I had already given up." I read it and cried in silence, not from pain, but from gratitude, because now I understood that love was also this, to insist with respect, to wait with maturity, to relearn with tenderness. And if he could see me now, it was because I had finally come back to life, not as the idealized woman, but as the real one. On the last page of my personal notebook, I wrote, "The woman who created a fake profile finally found a real life." I closed the notebook, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to open another, because now, life was writing for me, and I was ready to keep going, hand in hand with someone who saw me, but most of all, with myself. In early December, we started decorating the house for Christmas. We didn't make big plans, no long guest lists. We just pulled the box of decorations down from the closet and began, together, choosing what to use. Each item held a memory, a story, a pause. Frank showed me a gold star we bought when our daughter was still a baby. I had forgotten about it, but he remembered. And in that quiet gesture, I understood that some things remain, even when affection seems to have gone into hiding. We put the tree together slowly, not as a routine task, but as a reunion. I arranged the branches. He adjusted the lights. We didn't talk much, but every movement felt like another small attempt to care for each other. When we finished, we stood in front of the tree side by side. The lights reflected off our faces, faces marked by time, now more open to tenderness. Frank held my hand and said, "I think this is the most beautiful tree we've ever made." I began to look at Frank with more kindness, not like someone checking for mistakes, but like someone choosing to truly see. I noticed he started getting up first on Sundays, just to make coffee. I noticed he began wearing his wedding ring again, after years of keeping it in a drawer. I noticed he listened more, even when I was only saying small, ordinary things. And I realized that little by little, the man who once hid in silence was returning. Slowly, clumsily, but returning. One late afternoon, we went to visit my parents' grave. I brought flowers. He came with me. I didn't even have to ask. On the way back, he looked at me and said, "You've always been stronger than I am." I shook my head, but he insisted, "You faced things I ran from." I stayed silent. But inside, I understood the weight of what he had said. It wasn't a direct apology. It was something more, acknowledgement. And sometimes, that means more than any words. That same week, he received a letter from the brother he hadn't spoken to in years. I remember seeing him emotional, eyes full of tears, and realizing another kind of healing was happening there. I didn't say much, I just stayed close. And I understood that when we allow ourselves to love again, that love spills into other parts of life, into siblings, into children, into ourselves. Frank was becoming a man again, not just a husband. And I was becoming a woman again, not just a companion. On Christmas Eve, I wrote a letter to myself. I began with, "Thank you for not giving up on yourself." I wrote about the pain, the courage, the confusion, about the woman I had invented just to be seen, and the woman I had become in order to feel whole. I placed the letter inside my notebook, tied it with a ribbon, and put it on the highest shelf. It didn't need to be read now. It just needed to exist, just like I did. On Christmas Day, our house was full. Our daughter, sons-in-law, grandchildren, laughter, dishes being passed from hand to hand. It was noisy. It was life. It was everything I had once felt I had lost. Frank was by my side the whole time, not like before, distant in the middle of being present, but truly there. He held my hand, asked if I wanted more salad, watched the children with me like someone sharing the same wonder. He was quieter than before, but now his silences were comforting, and his quiet, steady. After lunch, while everyone chatted in the living room, he gently pulled me aside onto the porch. Outside, the afternoon was warm, the sky clear. He handed me an envelope. I was surprised. I opened it carefully and found a handwritten note inside. "You taught me that love isn't about finding someone perfect, but about choosing someone real every day. I choose you, even on the hard days, even when I fail, even when you challenge me. I choose you because now I see myself in you." I closed the envelope with tearful eyes. I hugged Frank tightly. I didn't say anything. Words wouldn't have been enough. And in that embrace, I knew it was possible to begin again, not by erasing the past, but by letting every scar become a map for loving better, a map for not getting lost again. That night, I sat down with the grandkids to tell stories. They asked for the usual ones, stories from their mom's childhood, the time Grandma forgot Grandpa's birthday, the first road trip we ever took. But at the end, the oldest, curious as ever, asked me, "Grandma, have you ever done something really brave?" I looked over at Frank, who was watching me from across the room with a half smile, and I answered gently, "Yes. One day, I reinvented myself." They laughed, not fully understanding, but I understood, and so did Frank. That night, as we turned off the lights in the house, Frank took my hand and held it firmly. "Are you happy?" he asked. I looked around. The glowing tree, half-empty glasses, the good kind of exhaustion that comes from joy. And I answered honestly, yes, because now I feel alive. And that was enough. More than any perfect happy ending, that was what I wanted most, to be fully alive. January arrived with a gentle calm. No promises, no grand plans, none of that rush the world tries to impose. We woke up slowly, had coffee on the porch, spoke little, and listened more. It felt like time had finally learned to move at our pace. Frank started tending the garden. I went back to sewing little things. Our house hadn't changed on the outside, but on the inside, it breathed differently. Now it held presence. It held truth. It held the two of us, everything we were and everything we were still learning to be. One afternoon, I went out for a walk on my own. I went back to the park where, months ago, I had created Claire. I sat on the same bench, looked at the same trees, listened to the same sounds, but I was no longer the same. I closed my eyes and pictured the woman I had been then, insecure, wounded, starving for someone's gaze. I wanted to hug her, to tell her it would pass, that she was so much more than what the mirror said, and that the love she was searching for began within her. When I got home, Frank was sitting on the porch steps, waiting for me. He didn't ask where I'd been. He just looked at me and said, "You've got that new glow again." I smiled. And for the first time, I realized he had a new glow too. Not the glow of youth, but the glow of maturity, of reconciliation. It was the glow of someone who had faced himself and chosen to stay. We decided to take a short trip, just the two of us. No fancy places or long itineraries. We picked a small town full of mountains and old cafes. We wandered through markets, listened to live music, laughed at silly jokes. One day, we sat down at a lakeside restaurant. Frank took my hand across the table and said, "This is the Vivian I wish I'd seen sooner." And I answered tenderly, "This is the Vivian I needed to find again." That night, back at the hotel, we opened a bottle of wine and talked about the future. No rush, no big dreams. We talked about growing older together, caring for each other, letting love evolve through every season. Frank looked at me and said, "I think I finally understand that loving means continuing to choose, even when it feels late." I nodded, because yes, love didn't save everything, but it saved us from giving up. On the way home, we passed the cafe where it all began, the same one where we'd met again, without knowing what to expect. Frank pulled the car over and looked at me. "Want to go in?" I smiled and said, "I do." We sat at the same table. The place hadn't changed, but we had. Now there was a rare lightness between us, like two people who had survived a storm and still believed in the breeze. I ordered a latte. He ordered tea. We laughed. He used to hate tea, but now said it helped his stomach. Time passes, yes, but the beauty is in letting it pass without letting it take us with it. We sat there in silence, looking at each other like two people quietly grateful to still be here. Not by chance, but by choice. That night, at home, Frank took an old photo out of the frame on the shelf. It was a picture of us from the beginning, young, still learning what love was. He looked at me and said, "I think it's time we take another one." So we did. With the phone camera, smiling softly, wrinkles showing, but our eyes more alive than ever. We placed the new photo in the same frame, not to replace the old one, but to show that love grows old too and becomes even more beautiful. Later, before bed, Frank asked me, "If you could go back in time, would you do it all again?" I paused for a few seconds, then said, "Maybe not the same way, but with the same heart. He smiled, kissed my shoulder, and whispered, "I'm glad you stayed." And I thought, I'm glad I came back to myself. I turned off the light, closed my eyes, and fell asleep in peace for the first time in a long while, knowing that now I didn't have to pretend to be someone else, because being me, exactly as I am, was finally enough. And the one who loved me could see that. If someone asked me today what the bravest moment of my life was, I wouldn't say it was facing surgery or creating a fake profile to get my own husband's attention. I'd say it was looking in the mirror after everything and still choosing to stay with myself, with the woman time had reshaped, that pain had refined, that love had once forgotten, but who had never stopped existing. The woman who learned that it's not others who make us feel worthy, it's us who give ourselves that value. And when that happens, everything changes. I didn't go back to who I was. Going back would have been too little. I went beyond. I became someone with more patience, more truth, more presence, and someone who now knows the most beautiful kind of love isn't the one that arrives like a storm. It's the one that, even after silence, still chooses to stay. So if you're listening to this and feel like you're fading inside yourself, please don't dim your light just because someone stopped noticing it. Come back to you, even if it's slow, even if it hurts. But come back, because you deserve to be seen, and most of all, by yourself.